just turn off your video and perhaps not show your name if that's what you want to preserve your privacy, but I just want to let you know. Okay, let's start officially. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gwenda Davey, and I'm the chair of the Melbourne branch of the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive. Welcome to this meeting today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge our First Nations. There are many people here with us today who come from different locations in the state of Victoria and perhaps overseas, as we had some overseas visitors in our last webinar. We recognise that wherever we come from, we are all, if we're in Australia, we are on Aboriginal land. We acknowledge elders past, present and forthcoming, and to any who may be with us today. We support all moves to constitutional recognition for Australia's First Nations and all moves towards reconciliation, justice and respect. You've all had an opportunity to watch this amazing film. It's one of Australia's most important films, Lousy Little Sixpence. It was the first documentary film to really expose the reality of the stolen generation's actions, which blighted our country for almost 100 years until the late 1970s. Lousy Little Sixpence was made in the early 1980s by award-winning director Alec, and we are delighted to have Alec with us today. We're also delighted to have another award-winning filmmaker, Daryl Delora, to act as our interlocutor in this Q&A session. As I said, you've all had the opportunity to view this important historic film. Okay, you will have an opportunity. I want to say many thanks to the Friends member, Chris Emery, who's the treasurer of the committee in Canberra, for hosting this Zoom event, and also to Bruce Watson from Melbourne for his organisation. And you will have an opportunity to contribute to this discussion through the chat facility. But I'll now hand over to Daryl Delora and Alec Morgan. So if you can bring them up, Chris.
Great. Thanks very much, Gwenda, for the introduction. And yes, Alec and I go back a long way because we worked together on his famous film Hunt Angels, which won a huge host of awards and of course was very much concerned with using archival materials, which is very relevant to us all here today, those of us that are from the Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive, of course. And when you look at Lousy Little Sixpence, I think you see that Alec has had that interest for years. So if I can first just say that if there are any Indigenous Australians in our group today, they should be aware that we might be talking about people who have died. And of course, if you've seen the film, all the characters in the film were born, you know, around the turn of the 20th century. So many of them, or probably none of them, would be with us today. So that's just a short warning. However, what I'd like to say first is just to welcome Alec here and thank him for being available, but also to really thank him for making the film, because it's such an important work and such a significant work. And it really gave Australians a chance to understand something about our history that I think people really didn't understand properly. And so the film is a great example of getting people who have their first person testament to what happened to them and having them speak. And because of that, it's so significant. And it's so significant because it's recorded their stories as documentary evidence for all time. But of course, the film's so much more than that. It's such a moving film. I was moved to tears watching it. And I remember watching it the first time many years ago, feeling the same emotional pull of it. It's a wonderful piece of documentary storytelling. They're fantastic characters, and it's put together in such a well-crafted way. And of course, as I mentioned before, Alec's real interest in using archival film comes through all the time. But first of all, I mean, hopefully everybody will have some great questions for Alec, and I'm really only here as an aid to that. But I'd really like to ask you, Alec, first of all, just what was it like working with those people? Because the people on the screen are extraordinary people, and I'd really love to know how you came in touch with them and invited them to ask their stories. And you must have had a great rapport with them, because that really comes across. And also the people behind the camera who you worked with, Lester, for example, Bostock, and his brother Gerry. They are incredible Indigenous elders who really, it's fascinating to see all these people working together to bring such a wonderful project to the screen.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and showing the film. It's an honour to be here, and particularly for people associated with the National Film and Sound Archive, which was takes me back to those days when it was in the I think it was in the basement of the National Library. Is that correct, Ray? The National Library in Canberra.
Yeah, Alec, the sound part of it was in the basement of the National Library. Film was on the 3rd floor, and
they had old Steenbecks, and you bring up 16mm prints. And
yeah,
it was great. I mean, so yeah, that was the first film I'd ever used archive. But how did I mean? It's a long story how it began, but I had made a film before that, and this is an important part of it, with wonderful Essie Coffey, who collaborated with Martha and Sarah, the Tyro Martha and Sarah, to make My Survival as an Aboriginal. And at the same time, I made a short film called Campbell Oldfellow Now, which was a 27-minute recreation of the life of Essie's uncle Brewarrina. So I had connections with Aboriginal communities up on the northwest of New South Wales for a few years before that. And so I'm speaking to my generation here. I actually didn't grow up in Australia. I grew up in New Zealand, but it was kind of a similar thing of, you know, we were the younger generation, the 60s and early 70s, that were sort of saying, you know, we want to know more about ourselves. That was an important context for this film. I mean, I grew up, you know, learning more about England in 1066, and you know, it was it's the same in Australia, that we were part of England, and we were the kind of generation that broke away from that. So there was a kind of mood, and you can see it in Australian feature films in the early 70s, a sort of, you know, conflict between Britain and New Zealand and Australia in particular. A lot of those films were those kind of themes. And so I loved history. And so when I went to England to do art school and realized that, you know, the idea is, if you went from New Zealand, you went to England because that's where culture was. We didn't really have a culture. In fact, Janet Frame, our only great writer, was in a psychiatric hospital. I never knew of any New Zealand artists when I grew up. But when I got there, I thought, well, you know, I'm from a mixed background of Polish, Irish, which I never found out, the Polish side, and illegitimate background. So I don't have attachment to England and colonialism. So to me, it seemed like this has nothing to do with the part of the world that I live. So when I came back to Australia, I kind of felt that I really want to know where I lived, on the land that I lived. And I was an actually shadow puppeteer. I made these wonderful shadow puppets, beautiful shadow puppets. And the stories were kind of satires, political satires, which I toured around with. I actually camped on Tom Zabricki's lounge room until they asked me to leave, making these shadow puppets for about 6 months. But someone invited me to go to this rather strange tour of Aboriginal communities in northwest New South Wales. And I didn't realize at the time that coming on, doing a show for them and workshops, number one, that was probably the first white person that had gone on there performing on a, and the question that got raised were two things. One, I'd try and go into the schools and perform. And these were adult shows, but were adapted for kids, but they were basically political satires. When I looked at libraries, I realized where there was, in Brewarrina, for instance, there was 60% Aboriginal children, and there was nothing in the libraries that was anything to do with their history. And so I was aware that, we live in, this import from Europe and import from England was still dominating the way we were teaching children. And also I'd ask, how did these kind of Aboriginal communities on the edge of these towns like Brewarrina, Bourke, Moree, how did they all get there? And everybody said, oh, they've always been there. And being interested in history, I couldn't read anything about it. There was nothing. You basically go to a history book and look at the massacres recorded. But when you came to the 20th century, there was absolutely nothing. And so it was this incredible silence. I met Essie Coffey, who was this incredible dynamic character, and stayed at Essie's place. There'd be 20 people staying at Essie's place in this place called Dodge City. It was called Dodge City. And there'd be 20 people and you just get your sleeping bag and sleep on the floor. And there's about 4 of us touring around. And so we toured around with Essie, who was also a country and western singer. So I didn't know it, but they kind of adopted me into the family. You don't know it sort of, you're part of the group, the mob now, but I got known as the puppet man. But I was also interested in, was the fact that there seemed to be this incredible separation between white and black. In fact, I had a few experiences where I went to get my car fixed or a van fixed, and a mechanic in Brewarrina, and the mechanic said, well, why don't you go and get your Abo mates to get it? So racism was thick on the ground up there. I'd come back to Sydney, and many Australians I met who were getting well educated had never been to see their country. And I was more fascinated at that time with what is this place called Australia? And so I was more fascinated by what is this division? How did racism come about here? And also Essie had these wonderful stories about the land. There's a very beautiful country up there. And their dispossession of the land and being forced into missions. So in that kind of ferment, that's how I'd taken a reel-to-reel tape recorder up there. I think it was one of the community video people. This is sort of mid-70s. And recorded, we started making a little movie. It was the first movie I was making, and it was terrible cutting and editing. But out of it grew the sort of my survival as an Aboriginal. And how did I mean, this is kind of important, but out of it, I was also recording around that time stories with elders who lived out of sight of Dodge City, down by the riverbank. And Essie introduced me to her elders and grandfather, and would take the interviews back and show the kids. And they were absolutely fascinated. But I was aware that there's kind of schism within the communities. There's something had been damaged here. Something wasn't quite gelling. And a lot of the women that I spoke to, elderly women, spoke of being taken away, or the word was apprenticed out. And I didn't, what's this apprentice out? But many of them have this terrible sense of shame and sorrow about being taken away. And that sort of stayed with me. And then we made My Survival and my film, and this sort of stuck with me, what's this apprenticed out? And the word Cootamundra Girls Home kept coming up, and tried to read about it, nothing you could read about. And so it kind of grew from there, around actually being in the communities themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that raises another thing I was going to ask you about, which is just how you did the research, because as you're saying, sometimes these stories aren't officially recorded anywhere, are they?
Well, they weren't, and that was the thing. I was an angry young man, I can say. I was furious that, you know, I was, and I got increasingly angry as I made the film, the fact that, you know, who are these people determining history, that you've left the best bits out in many ways. I'd seen evidence out there of, say, you know, look, for me, it was a personal journey as well. I was sick of hearing of Don Bradman and bloody cricket and, you know, the heroes that were being glorified. And I just thought, oh, come on, you know, that's so boring, you know, endless cricket. Sorry if anybody offend any cricket fan. But for me, it was like, what is this country and who are these people? And one of the things that was distinguished about Aboriginal communities is they had their own culture. And to me, culture is something that's alive. And there was this aliveness, a humor. And after I did my first show on Dodge City, I mean, I'd done a lot of shows here at the Opera House, and I kind of felt, because you do puppets here, you kind of treat it as only a kid's show. This was, you know, serious satire at that time. But when I performed on Dodge City, for instance, I always remember that no one clapped. And I thought, well, no one understands what this story is about, right? But then I was invited by this elderly man with a beat up guitar in this house where there was no furniture and it would run down, and he played the song on a, you know, beat up amplifier. And I just thought it was the most wonderful, you know, what is this, you know? And it was a Dougie Young song, an Aboriginal, you know, protest songwriter, you know, and I'd never heard of it. Well, you know, I grew up loving jazz and, you know, all that roots of music. And I thought, doesn't anybody in Australia heard of this music? I've never heard it being recorded. I've never heard this, you know, Indigenous music being played. So this was the 70s, and, you know, and there was this liveness, the humor and the liveness, and we were filming that, having a lot of good time doing it, making the films. But we were also aware together, because I hung around with Essie Coffey and I hung around with that mob, that racism was very present. So we kind of felt that we had to educate people. So the roots of My Survival was really to educate, get it into some, people have to know about what's going on here. And the same with Lousy Little Sixpence. You know, I mean, most of your films are still today, I have to say, are stumbling through between, you know, knowing what you're doing and sort of hoping you can keep going. It kind of grew like that. When I couldn't read anything about it, I was on unemployment benefits. I'm proud of my unemployment benefits time, because you couldn't speak to anybody about it. I kind of knew that there was probably 2 or 3 white people who knew about the stolen generation. So you're talking into a conversation about, which is a word Peter Reid invented, you know, didn't even exist. And so there was nothing. It was a nothingness. It's like you're in a void. So the first place I go, because I've always one of these very solitary people as well. I went to the Mitchell Library and went through you could go through newspapers in those days on unemployment benefits. And, you know, well spent unemployment benefits, let me say, you know, so, and then it sort of grew like that way, you know, to find the story. It was quite difficult because many of the women who spoke about being taken away, as we know from the Royal Commission into institutionalised sexual abuse, many victims don't speak out. In fact, they take it out on themselves. And so when I asked some of these women to talk, they were very ashamed of what had happened to them, or raped, or and this is their demeanour that sort of held in my memory after I'd spoken to them, that there was something terribly sorrowful about the whole process, and something that had split up these communities. It was all just intuition, really. And so it was putting this story together took a long time. And when I went to the National Film and Sound Archive to see if there's any film evidence, I'd go down to stay in Jack Waterford's house, who was the editor then of the Canberra Times, and walk over the bridge to the National Library, to the National Film and Sound Archive, and sit for days. I couldn't afford the sandwiches, they were a bit expensive. I'd sit for days at the Steenbeck, right? And it was the most exciting thing. You can imagine some of that footage, you know, to see this whole thing. Before I went to the National Film and Sound Archive, I must tell you this wonderful story. Cine Sound Movietone at that time had the negatives in Sydney in this building. And if you wanted to go and see any of the Cine Sound Movietone newsreels, you had to go and see Jim, who ran the place in Balmain, right? And Jim was this cantankerous old guy. You had to bring mint sandwiches or something to him, or a bottle of beer, before he had deemed to go down and look over. They were negatives, over 35mm negatives in a vault, right? And so, you know, finally you'd get Jim to go down and he'd get the 35mm negative and put it up on the bloody bench, and he'd go, "Oh, when are you going to look at the Avo stuff for, mate?" You know, and you go, "Oh, you know, nothing, Jim." And Jim, I remember Jim wheeling through these 35mm negatives, the original negatives, and seeing a bit of mold on it. So he'd break one part off and break the other part off, and then he'd splice it together. And you know, this was the state of things in those days, you know. The only good thing about it was we didn't have much money to make the film, and you could do a good deal with Jim, right? No one cared about copyright too much, so you got it fairly cheap. But yeah, I probably spent a good 6 months in the, as Ray points out, probably the third floor where they had these old Steenbecks, and just, you know, the absolute excitement to find someone like Burriger. You know, the Burriger clip was just like, because everybody thought it all began with, you know, the Gary Foley generation. You know, the protests began at Gary Foley, and here was evidence from 1933 of an Aboriginal man speaking to camera going, "This is our land, you know, you white people." That was unheard of as far as Australian history goes. So yeah, thanks to the National Film and Sound Archive having that staff. It was important to find the evidence visually. And I kind of felt like a lawyer, and because I moved between two worlds, between a white world and a black world, I knew the white attitudes at that time, and that was, if an Aboriginal person spoke, no, they're all bullshitting, they're all lying, you know, they make stuff up. So I knew that if you put an Aboriginal person on the screen talking to camera, talking directly to them, that would, I don't believe it. You know, the impact, the nature of racism is such that it becomes unconscious with people that they have these attitudes. So I just felt like a lawyer that I needed to find the evidence.
Yes. You must have been pretty surprised, though, were you, with the reaction to the film when it came out? Because the people that you've collected together and the rapport that you have with them, they really are incredibly convincing. I mean, I can't think that an audience could watch those films and that film come out thinking, oh no, I don't believe they just made that all up.
Yeah.
Was there a big difference between the reaction from a white audience and Indigenous audiences?
Yeah, and there's still this, I mean, there's kind of residue in terms of Indigenous audience today still through that. I had a lot of support. We had a lot of support from like the Redfern community, legal Aboriginal. In fact, you know, Jack Patton at Kamaragundja, his son was running the legal service. So they knew what we were doing and there was a lot of support, you know, they knew it. But I remember the first screening with Gerry, being with Gerry, and we screened at, I think, the Teachers Federation Hall, just a test screening for the crew, cast and crew, and hundreds of people turned up.
Mm.
Word was getting around about it. I remember the first screening, and we screened it and we were in the projection booth, and when it finished, there was no sound. And I looked at Gerry and thought, oh, we're really fucked up here, haven't we? You know, and someone came out and said, no, don't worry, people are just stunned. They don't know, you know, it's just silent. And that was a lot of the screenings. But
so was that an Aboriginal audience, or?
No, it was white.
Was it white?
You know, mixed up.
Mixed,
Yeah. But I kind of knew at the time, I guess I was in the right place at the right time kind of feeling, you know, like we kind of knew as a generation too, like remember Henry Reynolds' book came out, you know, The Other Side of the Frontier. There was an acknowledgement coming out that there was resistance to white rule.
Yeah.
There was an increasingly, as you can see through the 70 features, an interest in who are we? It was about identity. And so I kind of sensed, even when I did, you know, stumbling through it, I kind of knew that this was a very important story. I just thought, how do I do it? You know? The main thing was, of course, I was being supported by Gerry and Lester, who we worked together. And also people like Martha and Sarah. You know, on the ground, I'd written the script quite quickly, and people were reading and say, you know, this has got to be made. So there was, and even the Australian Film Commission, there was support. Like, you know, people were aware of it because now the story had been written. You know, it's the first time it come together really, and we did cut a reel. I remember screening it. Doesn't mean to say it wasn't. It was incredibly hard to raise the funding outside of the AFC. Luckily, the AFC was there because basically, if you go and see people and talk about it, they just, what are you talking about? You know, so you're talking about something people don't know. And the attitude was, if you went to government departments, I remember, you know, having a few cries, good cries of frustration. Because there was this attitude that, oh, Aboriginal people don't want to know their past, they just want to get a house and a car and live like us. And that was the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, which was the big bureaucracy in Canberra. And because I'm white, I sort of live between two worlds. You know, there's an advantage being a white person in this battle between, because they tell me all the things to my face, you know, believing that I sort of agree with their racist attitudes, you know. I was saying where I grew up, you know, I'm aware of racial attitudes, and you know, they would speak to me about, they would complain, the bureaucrats in the Department of Aboriginal Affairs who are all white, and they'd say, oh, these Aboriginal families come in and they, you know, it's the end of the day and I just want to go home and I've got problems, and they just complain about everything, you know, and you go, yeah, okay. So on that sense, you know, I'm able to hear from the two worlds, right? I mean, one of the important things was that came clear to me was Aboriginal people saying, we just want to be heard. We just want to be listened to. And when you got these earplugs of racism, like, you know, in Australia, it just prevents people from seeing it. For me, I was kind of lucky I didn't grow up with those attitudes because I lived next to a library and I was always this kid reading about books. You know, so I grew up in a fairly, you know, my father was a builder, there were tradespeople, you know, the attitudes. And when things went bad, the Maoris were to blame, you know. So I kind of missed out on all that world. I was more interested in cultures and world and, you know, those kind of things. And when you went to places like Aboriginal communities, there was, to me, this incredible lightness. They were poor, you know? So the judgment we'll be making on how they looked and their poverty, but their cultural, and I mean culture is, you know, humour and the ability to tell stories and the ability to live your life as best you can was vibrant to me. So, and I think one of the problems has always been that, you know, the experiences I had that came about with the, you talk about the rapport, is because I grew up and I wasn't allowed to go to art school because we didn't have a culture. So I grew up as someone feeling I don't have a culture. You've given me a culture called England, but I don't have any connection to that. What is my culture? So I could understand their grievances quite easily. That, you know, and it was Sydney was so fucking boring. And that's everybody's listening to Rolling Stones and bloody smoking dope. And oh man, I just wanted to get out of there. Something interesting, you know. And it was interesting, and there was a purpose to what we were doing. You know, it's still the same today. You know, like people suffer from racism. And even today, we could solve a lot of racism and do something. And just a few months ago, Morrison comes on and says, gee, we've failed with, you know, closing the gap. We're going to listen this time. You know, and you go, yeah, okay, listen, yeah.
Yeah. Been going on an awful long time, hasn't it?
Well, it's, I'm just finishing a film about Bill Onus, you know, the great leader in Melbourne, you know, and man, the whole life of frustration of trying to get whites to listen to him. I mean, that was a decision about having people speaking directly to camera. Right?
Yeah, well,
Margaret Tucker, straight to camera.
So, Alec, when did you first meet Margaret Tucker?
Well, I was having a lot of problems. Gerry and I were having a lot of problems finding people who would talk on camera. And mainly because of that shame and the guilt. And also trying to raise the money to do it because we were just being kicked out everywhere. And then, she wrote a book and I got hold of this book called, I've forgotten the name, but she talked about being taken away and torn away from her mother and everything, right? So I caught the train to Melbourne, the overnight train down to Melbourne, and went and saw Margaret in her flat. And she was just this wonderful, articulate, beautiful person. So I rushed back to Sydney and it was Martha and Sarah said, what are you doing? I said, oh, this wonderful Margaret Tucker. And she said, you better get down there and film it straight away. So I'm glad I did. I managed to whip up about $1,000. I got John Witteron on camera, on sound. Martha came down on camera. We just set it up in her room and filmed her. You know, and thank goodness for people, you know, having people like Martha and others who just say, you better go and, you know, don't wait, just get down there.
Your credits read like just an incredible, you know, a pinboard of important people in documentary industry, actually. So
yeah, there was a lot of you know, like we got John Scott, top editor. John and I worked on Wrong Side the Road, you know, slept in the same room. You know, there was a lot of good talent. There's a lot of good talented people who come in and, you know, if you're trying to get something, it's not big money, but we kind of sense when we did the when we filmed Margaret talking about being taken away, we were all in tears. And, you know, when we saw the rushes, we went to one of the labs, colour film or somewhere, and saw the, you know, the rushes. I just thought, we've got it. She just really comes across. So we did cut a small reel with Margaret and a few photographs. I mean, in those days too, no one really cared about Aboriginal history. And that, you know, it wasn't sexy. And it certainly wasn't sexy on television. You know, it certainly wasn't a sexy thing to do.
Well, when I've made films, I mean, the ABC have actually said to us, if you make a film about Aboriginal people, an Aboriginal story, it comes on, everybody will switch off.
Yeah.
All your viewers will switch to another channel.
I mean, we basically, Tom Zabricki and I think it was Tom's idea to get a petition to get the ABC to see Lousy Little Sixpence. You know, it was that kind of attitude. I mean, they also didn't like independent filmmakers. You know, like we were the first who got independent films on there through that film. We got screened at the Sydney Film Festival, and such a great response to it that we set up a petition. And finally, I think in the press, I called them a few nasty names, and they basically called Tom and I in there and bought it, not for a huge amount of money, but it did open the door to independent views. And this is the important thing, is a film like Lousy Little Sixpence can't be made within one of those institutions. It's a film that's done by a passion of a few people, stupidly living on the dole. You know, it's a passion. Filmmaking is a passion. And you have to keep going at it. And I had a few doona dies where you go, you know, that's enough, you know, I can't. And I was lucky to be partnered with Rosie, who'd come in after day 3 and said, well, are you going to get up or are you going to lie there? So having people in your life like that are very important in these kind of journeys, you know. It can be very dispiriting.
It's a sad thing that in a way the industry has gone a full circle now, so that truly independent documentary is very hard to make. It's all through the TV networks, and you have to conform to their idea of what factual or unscripted filming is, and that usually means a presenter, some famous person or something like that, you know. So it's really a battle that has to be fought again, I think, don't you think?
Oh, I'm just, you know, the film Ablaze about Bellonas is now 6 years, right? And you've been through this, Daryl, you know, been kicked out, you know. Tony Stevens is editing at the moment. We're just doing we're up to finishing the rough cut now, and we had to delay it. But most of the funding came from Victoria, so that's why we were doing post-production down there. But that, you know, Tom's the producer, or Tom Zabricki's the producer, and we were just being tossed out left, right, and centre. I mean, it's even tougher than it was with Lousy Little Sixpence.
Yeah.
And I think because there was very much a strong support for telling our own stories in those days, and there was an awareness that we didn't know something. We need to know something about ourselves and our past, and that we, as I say, I'm part of that generation who was saying, I want to know about where I live. I want to know, you know, and there was a continuous historic growth throughout the later 80s and the 90s until Howard came in, of course, and you can see the reaction of Howard to this, you know, the black armband of history, devastating effect he's had on knowing, you know, independently who Australia is. And it still hasn't been rectified today. And unfortunately, the situation today, I would say, is far more difficult. And that film in particular is far more difficult than Lousy Little Sixpence was. I mean, this is 6 years, that took 3 years. And a lot of the early stuff with Lousy Little Sixpence was the second film I'd really done, and I haven't really produced anything. So you're stumbling around a lot. But this one, yeah, we're still alive.
Keep at it.
Oh, it's wonderful to feel that, you know, we're somehow ahead of everything, and we're going to have the film finished, and hopefully the Melbourne Independent Film Festival will be on, International Film Festival will be on in August next year, and we'll screen. We were going to screen last year, but you know, COVID came in. But yeah, so I guess also too that one of the journeys for me was as I was trying to make the film, I always felt, you know, there's a lot of politics in Aboriginal society. It's who you're grouped with. And the grouping I was with was Margaret and the people in the film, and Gerry and Lester and a few others. And they all backed me and all backed the film. Now, that's your group and you work within that. But I learned a lot because I didn't, you know, I learned Margaret Tucker was not just someone who'd been taken away, but she was a major political fighter for Aboriginal rights. And her sister, you know, Geraldine Briggs was a major, you know, the Briggs family, you know, Briggs, the Sapphires, you know, that's the Briggs. The Briggs are a major family in Melbourne. And so when you're in that community, I remember going off trying to get some money to make the film and coming back to Auntie Geraldine and saying, gee, it's tough out there, you know. She said, no, you know what we've been through. So I grew to understand what is it when you're, you know, I'm white, but when your color of your skin stands out and they have these incredibly ugly racist attitudes towards you, you know, the struggle they would have had was something that I was learning about the country I was living in. So that was a living process too, of learning just how hard it would have been for them in those days in the 30s. And that's why in Lousy Little Sixpence it has the political side to it, because I never felt from someone like Margaret or Geraldine or the others in the film, Bill Reid, they were actually victims. You know, they had terrible things happen to them. Their life was a struggle, but they were also fighters.
Yeah.
And the resistance to me to white colonial policies is an important thing to me to understand as, you know, what happened to them. So the second part of Lousy Little Sixpence being about their fight against, you know, the policies of taking the children away was vital to me in telling, because the attitude at that time amongst whites, a lot of the attitude was, we helped them. You know, these poor, unfortunate Aboriginal people, primitives, we helped pull them up to wherever they are. And I just thought, when you know the story, that's bullshit. In fact, all the white policies, the colonial policies, you know, assimilation, you know, protection, all that bullshit has failed. And it's failed not because it was basically flawed, but because of Aboriginal resistance to that policy. If there wasn't Aboriginal resistance to these white policies, we would not have the wonderful Aboriginal music. We would not have the wonderful Aboriginal filmmaking, Indigenous filmmaking. We would not have that wonderful art in the centre of Australia that we all have on our walls. We would not have that richness if the policy of assimilation, for instance, which went right through to the 1970s, continued. We would not have that in Australia, because our aim as whites was they would give up their culture, their language, and become like us. You know, like crazy. I mean, you know, come on, I grew up in New Zealand. You know, as a kid who just grew up painting, I knew more of my friends. They thought I was weird because I liked Picasso. You know, like I grew up in that kind of boring suburban world, and we just made fun of it all the time. The same with Aboriginal people make fun of it all the time. I mean, it's the humor is a part of, you know, surviving really and resistance. But I mean, that's still today my kind of one take on why the films are important. The other take is the anger came out of the fact that Australia is a very wealthy nation. And there's two types of suffering. One is suffering that we all get from, you know, sickness and illness and cancers and those things we can't, you know, being run over. The other one is unnecessary suffering. There's enough wealth in this country to solve all those problems that we talk about, widening the gap. You know, I spent some time with the film with Bills over with communities in the Bills film over in Pilbara. And North Headland and Port Hedland, you see the wealth of this country on these huge trains with mineral ore being across the landscape, 2 kilometres long, 24 hours a day, going to ships in that harbour. And you can see 20 ships, and people said there's 20 more over the horizon. And they're taking that wealth out of the country day after day, right now. And I was there at the time when 20 Aboriginal communities, not rich people, poor people, were being closed down. And if you said you were related to those communities, you could be cut off your unemployment benefits, your welfare. And, you know, we still have today, who was it who got some recognition in the Queen's Awards for helping Aboriginal communities? None other than, what's his name, whose name I forget, with the big ears and the budgie smugglers.
Tony Abbott.
Tony, yeah, we're still doing it. I can switch on Channel 7. At the end of every Channel 7 news, we have something about royalty, you know? Even the ABC does the bloody royal family. Still, you know, it's so awful. It's so, the stranglehold is just awful. I mean, you can see where I'm coming from, right? I mean, and also I could sing a country and western song too, right? So I almost beat Elsie Coffey at the Burke Talent Quest, right? So what I'm saying is that, you know, the suffering could easily be fixed. We don't have to have 120 young Aboriginal people in the Kimberley committing suicide. We do not need our institutions filled with young Black youth. And this is the reality, much like the reality we've just seen in America. We have a reality in the country I'm living in. And I will fight to my death, in my last breath, this thing called racism. It is hideous in its destruction of people. It is, you know, ugly, and it has no reality. You know, the people I met in Aboriginal communities were kind, they were friendly, they were loving, and they had real problems. And, you know, it's still going on today. I could go out to Brewarrina today. I bet it's probably worse.
Mm. Well, one of the things that struck us when we watched the film was that not only were these injustices, you know, tantamount to slavery, inflicted upon the Aboriginal people who were taken and so on, but there were white families that were making, you know, exploiting those people and making, you know, making money out of those Aboriginal people, having them work for free and so on as their slaves. Did you ever get to know who those families were? Because it'd be really interesting to have some sort of accountability there. Which one of the greatest of Australia's families was actually having slave labour work for them for 40 years, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I would take it as fact as much as you might, you know, look at America, you know, the slavery that went on there. I mean, it's been well documented. I mean, far more better documented in America, that link of slavery even today than it is here. I really didn't have any interest. You know, look, the thing is, I don't kind of condemn people, white people so much. I can be angry, but that's the nature of racism, is that there's always a rationale for it. And I see what I'm trying to do is bring truth or historical information via the archives, the film. So that's why I love the archives and spent so much time. I mean, the film I'm doing on Bill Onus is based on a film that contains, you know, a lot of the stories about slavery in Pilbara. In fact, you know.
Alec, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because it's just, I think I could listen to you for forever, just about. But time is getting on, and we might want to ask the audience if they've got any questions for you. If people want to send a question through by chat, that they might like to do that.
There's one on chat.
Jocelyn, do you want to speak to your question? Australia needs to do a review of philanthropists, quote unquote, and the source of their wealth.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so. And first, thanks so much, Alec, for the film. It really is wonderful. And thank you to Daryl for organising this and all the other organisers. But I did put down that in Cambridge, where I'm living at present in the United Kingdom, there is a review going on of so-called philanthropists who got their money through slavery, and there are efforts being made to change names and so on. But I actually wanted to come to a point that you'd made about evidence and needing to seek evidence. And the irony here is that, of course, the best evidence is the evidence from people themselves, and that's a recognised principle in the law. And I was reminded of the Hindmarsh Bridge dispute, where the Narrandjeri women were saying there's women's business attached to that land, but they had to go into the archive to find written material justifying what they were saying. And once they went into the library and found the archival material, they were then told that they were liars because they were making it all up from what they got from the library. And that's really the point that you were making, that you felt you had to go in and get some evidence to support the Indigenous people's voices, whereas their voices are what actually counts. So anyway, thank you.
Well, thanks for that comment. Yeah, evidence is, as I say, making a film, the archives, having the archives and access. As I say, I was in a lucky historical position because even getting photographs, I remember going to the New South Wales archives who were down at the Rocks, and I said, I want to interest in the Aboriginal Protection Board. And they said, oh, they were probably in shoe boxes in that room. So there is something about the priorities in those days. And it's still the battle. History is a battle, and I think Howard brought that out. It threatens people when we bring out new knowledge. New knowledge is always not openly welcomed by everybody, and particularly those who've got something at stake. It's well documented, and I can understand perfectly what's happening in America. I can understand perfectly why they're pulling down these statues. Because people have written about it, and I can gain that knowledge about the other side of history. And as I say, the silences grow out of the fact that history was in the hands of they say the history was at that point when I was, starting out on this film, history was in the hands of the winners, if you like. And the idea of an alternative history as something that came out of the kind of 60s and 70s. In fact, I haven't seen it yet, but Brazen Hussies, I'm sure, is showing, there's always been people, let's not forget, there's always people out there who never went along with the whole racist stuff, right? And, there has always been people who supported, the Aboriginal cause, if you like. And quite often they had difficult lives. And even in, Bill's film, the people like the trade unions, for instance, were supporting Aboriginal rights way back. The Communist Party was supporting Indigenous rights way back. The people who don't want that to shift are the people who are gaining from it. And that's why I don't see racism in Australia is specific to Australia, but it also is part of British colonialism and the way it functions so successfully that when it came to Australia, it had worked its way through Africa and other places, and it worked out a system that what they were doing with the stolen children, and this to me was quite early on, that why the whole stolen generation wasn't because they were rescuing them. In some cases, there will be some rescues, yes. But it was just part of a system that Britain did in every colonial society where there were indigenous races. They wanted cheap labour. And cheap labour is reason for racism become this so-called scientific study, and the bullshit that came around it, and people in universities wrote about it and how unintelligent they were. You can look at America today, you know, the backing towards Trumpism is this false views. Now, who's benefiting? You know, I'll tell you who's benefited from, you know, Trumpism is Donald Trump. I mean, he's a great, you know, illness of what capitalism can be. So to me, Australia only fits into a much larger picture in terms of racism. That is, it doesn't have this vitality about racism. It just puts people in categories. So if you put them in a category, that because of their color, you can use them as cheap labor. That's how,
Alec,
I'm interested in talking to someone who got cheap labor, because they would turn around and say, well, that was the law. And that was the law. The law in Australia, and particularly in places like Queensland and Western Australia, was they weren't allowed to be paid equal wages. I mean, Harry Watt came out here to make The Overlanders and a few other films, and he wanted to pay equal wages, and he wasn't allowed. You know, it's the system, the governmental system of these policies was supporting building the economy through cheap labor, and the cheap labor were people who were basically black.
Alec, I'm particularly interested in the outcome of these current actions for recovering stolen wages that happened. And I understand that the Queensland government has actually made some kind of settlement, even though it's about, I think, $190 million, even though it's not very adequate compared to the real amount. And Western Australia is currently negotiating a settlement too. I'm wondering, what about other states though? And I know the Northern Territory is complex because for many, they didn't even get independence in the Northern Territory till 1978. But do you know about, actions that are going on in other states apart from Queensland and the Northern Territory to recover these stolen wages? Alec?
Well, look, the stolen wages, funny, I've been writing articles about films that basically were propaganda for racism. There's a great one, Ray would probably know it, or someone else might know it. It's called The Native Problem in Queensland, made in 1937. And I'm writing about that and the making of it. It's almost like Heart of Darkness, where they went on a boat up and, but the thing was, and I forget his name, so I've had to put it away. But the guy made that film. He was the chief protector of Aborigines. In fact, hopefully there's a book about these films of propaganda, race propaganda in Australia. In fact, one's made by the government, like Ariyonga, End of the Walkabout, assimilation policy. And this one is basically where he got caught stealing. They put all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander money into these so-called accounts to keep them safe for the Indigenous workers. And he was siphoning off the money and the interest to pay for this film he was making and other things, right? So he was proud of showing that he was dealing with the problems of our Indigenous Australians, yet he was siphoning off their money and stealing their money to do it. So he had a great, the Queensland, Department of Native Affairs was looked by the rest of Australia as a great example of, native protection agency, yet he was using this money he stole from the Indigenous people's accounts. They weren't allowed to be paid the money directly, right? I mean, this is why I still feel Australian history has never really been told. I mean, I find that story phenomenal. And then, of course, those historic events. The other thing was, And it's one of the problems of when, 24 years after or whatever, after Lousy Little Sixpence was made, gee, we're mean, aren't we? I mean, we say sorry, but where was the payment? When it
Alec,
comes, we can say sorry, but we can't pay these people for the terrible, like we've had this Royal Commission now. I hope people understand that the Royal Commission at least showed that people who are victims of these terrible injustices and Aboriginal life was an institution up until the end of the 60s.
Alec, that film, the native problem in Queensland, was passed over to the archive in the, I think, the late 1970s by a Queensland public servant who I can't name, and I was not to reveal where it came from. So it just gives you some idea of the, the sensitivities. He wanted it preserved, but we couldn't say how we got it.
For goodness sake, yeah.
Oh, look, there's a lot of things. Thanks for that, Raymond. I'll find out more. But I did an article that published in Top Journal on the children of the wasteland, for instance, and also I did an article on the censorship that they tried to have for Aboriginal audiences, Indigenous audiences in Australia and Papua New Guinea, which ran from 1928 to 1950, right, where they would do a separate cull of films that were suitable for the native to watch. I guess what I'm trying to say about Australia is racist as any other country. We've clouded it over, unfortunately, and we don't see the direct results because most of us live in the city. But I just need to go out there occasionally if I went to Brewarrina or somewhere, as I was having that experience, day-to-day experience, to understand that racism went on. You get a different picture of Australia. I've never, that journey into Australia's kind of heart, if you like, certainly has changed me. And I do know Lousy Little Sixpence for Aboriginal people was incredibly significant even today. I think I got it right because I just listened to what they wanted to do. Like I just felt like, I didn't feel like, we have this concept of the artist or the filmmaker as an individual. I still feel it today that and I tried to explain to white people, I don't feel like I'm this individual artist. I just feel like I'm a kind of foot soldier. I'm just part of something bigger than me. And that was important. I was just trying to be a conduit, if you like, to have this voice come through. And I knew the strength of that film was Margaret Tucker and the other people. That's what I heard. When I heard these stories, I was crying. When I saw the vibrancy in Aboriginal life, it made me feel wonderful. And I saw on the other side, the suffering and the genuine human suffering and the sorrow, so unless we get out there and start to see that, to me, racism in Australia, we haven't really uncovered the racism that it is. I mean, racism is nothing special. It's just the lowest common denominator. It's lazy, but it's also brutal, and it's also vicious, and it's also, put someone down because of the color of their skin. That's the word, that's really something that's worth fighting against,
Alec, I think I should ask if there are any more questions for you from the audience. That we've had a few, and some good comments have come through too. But
there's comments. Chat.
If on chat, if there's any more coming through.
Yeah. I've got one.
Yeah.
I just congratulations, Alec, on a very important film. I was interested to see the Kamargunja walk off, the strike, because my first contact with that was seeing Pecan Summer, which I'd only seen the film of, and it was due to be staged at the end of October at the Melbourne Recital Centre.
Yes.
You may or may not know that, but I'm hoping it will be scheduled at some point, because that in itself, your footage showed the actual, supplemented the information, which was very good. Thank you very much. But what I found very interesting was the 150th reenactment in 1938, and the reaction to savages, formerly occupied by savages.
Yes.
Incredible, incredible.
They went, I mean, thank you for your comments. None of that is the great thing now, if, you know, for us, I love research. I kind of sense there's something there, and it's like a detective story to me. And a detective, I love to hunt out the information. For instance, you can go on Trove now at the National Library online and start to see racism. Look, as much as there's a cloud over that past, was part of Australian life. And it's this fear of the North. There's always been historically the fear of the North, and they would combine, by the Asians would come down to Australia, and the Aborigines, the black people, would unite with them and have a revolution, particularly in the North. So Australia has lived through, you know, all the research says to me is there was a period when and of course the press play a big part in playing on these fears. So these massive fears that you'll see in the press, for instance, about Aboriginal people, was this terrible fear of the difference. And it's also that we were, as whites, part of a colonial administration, if you like. And there's always a fear at certain historical times of the native. The native is always kind of seen as something fearful. And you know, you can see how wrong we can get it, because we come from the other side. We come from the conqueror kind of mentality, and that mentality was anybody who was different, a particularly different colour, was something you feared.
Alec, I wanted to ask Daryl if he's got any more questions that he wants to ask you, because we'll have to consider when we're going to finish this wonderful afternoon soon.
Thanks,
Do you have
Gwenda.
anything further, Daryl?
Not really. The only thing I'd like to say, Alec, is that I really love the faces of the people and the direct, you know, talking to them directly, and the talking heads. And I think that's such a wonderful thing to be able to see, and something that seems to have gradually disappeared from documentary filmmaking in a way. Talking heads are seen as boring or something, but you see so much in the character of the faces of Bill Reed's face. Is such a beautifully shot, and all the people in the film, I think, and you get so much out of their personal testimony when you see them like that.
Yeah, it actually took us a long time to edit the film. It looks very simple. We realised, John Scott and I, that we had to keep the pace with their pace. And the historical decision to have people talking directly to cameras, because it never been done before. And I wasn't necessarily a documentary maker there. I was actually more involved in theatre, so drama was more natural. And I was thinking, how do you tell the story? One, did dramatise it or did documentary? And I thought a lot of the Australian interpretation through drama was all quite romantic. It was a romanticised, it was beating around the bush, if you like. And also the other thing as part of documentary is you're talking to an audience who don't have information on what you're talking about. So then it was almost pretty suddenly out of that awareness at that time, and you know, in 1980, that whenever they had Aboriginal people, they never talked usually directly to camera, or was always us telling the story. So it sort of came in an instant, really, to have. I remember the image of Margaret talking directly to camera, and there was a picture in my head that she would talk directly to camera. And basically that was, you know, that was that choice to have them tell their story. As I say, I kind of work the same way. You know, I work in collaboration with people. I'm not, I've always worked in collaboration. I'm working now with Terry Kionis, you know, who's the grandson who, you know, sang in Pecan Summer. He's an opera singer, and his grandson. So I work with that community. In fact, you know, related to Margaret Tucker. And
Excuse me.
in fact, I'm back.
Where's the film?
Huh?
When are you going to show the film?
Well, it'll be a national at the national premiere at the Melbourne Film Festival in 2021 if it opens.
I think he might be referring to Lousy Little Sixpence.
Yeah.
And if he is, actually, you're meant to have been able to see it already. There's a link that you will have received in the last few days. I think everybody received the link, and you look at it in your own time. And this is billed only as a question and answer session. So sorry about the misunderstanding there.
Thank you.
It's still available. Is it still on Vimeo available, Daryl?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it's still there to watch. Probably not for much longer though.
Yeah.
So if you've got the link, you can watch it.
Okay, we'll leave.
Good. Chris, I need to ask, Chris, since you've popped up, I need to ask you what time, and you're the hosting this session, what time do we need to close this session? Chris, can you answer that? Chris?
When you're finished.
I think he's, Chris?
I think it's probably more to do with how much more Alec can bear talking. Since
That's
we've
right.
dragged a lot out of him.
We have had a lot out of him, absolutely. Well, perhaps we should ask if there are any more questions or comments. Is there anything more you want to say at the moment, Daryl? Or
well, can I ask a question, please?
Yes,
because I've had a question up there on chat for a little while.
Right.
And I'd be interested to know, Alec, whether you had any involvement at all with Phil Noyce's film Rabbit Proof Fence, if you have any involvement. And secondly, what you thought of the film in terms of perhaps trying to commercialise your documentary to some extent.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. First of all, I don't see this as my story. You know what I mean? Like, it's a story of a community of people. You know, it's their story as much. As I say, I feel like I'm a conduit. I take it on personally and passionately to get to the end of the story, that I make it for people. But it's also, that's what I say, that's what I mean. I feel, look, I just happened to be in that position where the story came to me, and I was angry enough and stupid enough to continue doggedly with as Daryl's smiling a bit there, you know, when you get your teeth, I'm like a book terrier, you know. I actually felt this was the most important story to tell in Australia. I felt, you know, I was serving those people. I admire those people. Those people are my heroes, you know. Essie Coffey was my hero. These people were wonderful. I met Aboriginal people who were doing things out in society, up in Brewarrina, looking after 20 kids, and the matriarchs in each community, trying to look after a community which was just being pulled apart by alcohol and drugs and everything, you know, and under enormous pressure. These people were my heroes. So I had no problem serving them, if you like, and serving the story. So it's not my story in a way. I tried the best to understand from my point of view, I'm going to talk to white people, my people who don't know anything about it, how best to tell a narrative that will communicate what it was all about in a way that, as film is, you hope you move your audience, you hope you make them think, and you hope that the information gets out there. As I say, our kind of the idea of making film was to educate people, and it still is. I mean, the vacuum is a dangerous vacuum in Australia. And unfortunately, the Howard years, I believe, did such damage to the knowledge of ourselves, and particularly of Indigenous Australia, that all I feel with the same film, you know, like what keeps me going is that it's not my story, it's about these people, and it's them who live on screen. And I, you know, like the Margaret, just being with Margaret Tucker, just being with those people was an honour, a great honour to me. I thought they were just Australia's heroes. Why are you talking about Don Bradman? You should be talking about these people. It's that kind of stroppiness, you know. So,
Alex, I'm going to give you a very heartfelt thanks very shortly. But I think before we let you go, since we've got this unique opportunity of having with us today two filmmakers who've collaborated on Hunt Angels. I think you both did, didn't you? Is that right, Daryl? You both, you were
Yes,
whether
yes,
you might
I was an executive producer.
a few words about Hunt Angels.
and there's the Melbourne rescue again with Daryl. Daryl, and we shot it quite a bit in Melbourne, didn't we? We edited in Melbourne, you know, and Sue Maslin, producer, and you know, I mean, thank goodness, you know, you work with these guys. It's wonderful. You know,
how can we see Hunt Angels now? Where's it available?
You'd be able to see it. We could stream it the same way as we've streamed the other films. Yeah, just be a matter of working it out.
Oh well, good.
I just want to say as about Lousy Little Sixpence. I mean, part of it I was aware of. You know, many years went by, and recently when I was doing this film, Ablaze, I went to the Pilbara, and I went back to communities where I hadn't been to for years, like Terekies, you know, related to Margaret Tucker. And you know, it was so wonderful. It was so unexpected too, because you know, 30 odd years, over 30 years had gone past. But I went to Canberra to the National Film and Sound Archive, and Peter White was running the Indigenous section. And there was this meeting went on, and he said, "Oh, this is Alec Morgan," to an Aboriginal younger woman. And she said hello and started walking away. And he said, he made Lousy Little Sixpence. And she turned around and basically ran back and hugged me. And, you know, she said, when I was a kid, my family went to see it in Adelaide. I was from Adelaide, and the whole community went to see this film. And she said they didn't see the second film. They all went to the cafe and they sat down talking about what had happened to them. And this is one of the things that happened. You see, if you look at Lousy Little Sixpence, I could only know at that time, I thought it only happened in New South Wales and Victoria. I had no idea that it happened in other parts of Australia, because the newspapers you had then were local newspapers. And then I went down to Melbourne and looked in the, you know, Melbourne Library and went through the Melbourne libraries. So I got a visit after the film came out. I got a visit from John Pilger, who had been filming up in the Northern Territory. And he said, "I wanted to meet you because, you know, I went to these communities in the Northern Territory and they're all watching this film. And they're all saying it happened here." So the whole, what happened to that film afterwards, most, you know, out of the blue to me, was the fact that people in different communities were taking that film around and screening it in communities and saying, we're going to speak out too because this happened to us. So that kind of effect was the biggest shock to me. So, yeah, and I went to the Pilbara and I said, "Oh, you know, I'm so-and-so, I made this film." And they said, "Well, it'd be a privilege to work with you. I want to work with you." So, and even today with the Yorta Yorta people, who are the, you know, the Yorta Yorta Kamaragunja people, Wayne Atkinson, who's a historian there and part of the group, said they still screen it and they still show it to education and, you know, Indigenous education. And so the film has a life of its own. The film has a life of its own afterwards that reached far beyond what I would have ever thought that it would have. I kind of felt it was important and it would go on for a long, it would, you know, it was made in such a way, but I never, that impact 30 years later was only happened a couple of years ago. It was really something came out of the blue to me.
Alec, I'm going to thank you shortly, but first of all, I'm going to ask Daryl, is there anything, I think it is time that we concluded this meeting. I think we'll warn you out, Alex, with this wonderful talk.
Happy day. Happy day. I'm
about
so
this timeless film.
Donald,
And,
Donald,
yes.
it's
Oh,
Donald,
wow.
Donald.
Yes, fantastic.
I've actually ordered a Donald Dump toilet
Right.
brush. You can put a
Oh my
Donald Dump toilet
yes.
brush. He's gone.
Wow.
He's gone.
Yeah.
We do it for a reason, to get rid of there are a lot of people in the world like this who, you know,
Absolutely.
make lots of money out of those people.
Gwenda, before we leave,
Yes.
is
Yes.
it possible to ask Alec?
Yeah.
I thought one of the great scenes in the film was having the two women sitting on the hay, on the bale of hay. I thought that was so fantastic. It's one of the great scenes in the film. Don't you agree?
Well, there's a story behind that.
I had a suspicion about this.
We went to Kamaragunda, and that's shot on Kamaragunda, right? And Geraldine is younger than Margaret, they're sisters. And we were filming Geraldine sitting on the box because it was a hot day and we didn't have any chairs, so we got the and Margaret was up the back walking through the shop, going, "What does she know? I'm the oldest one. I'm the elder. I know more stories." So we decided the only way we could get Margaret to be silent so we could film Geraldine was to have them both sit there. But it worked beautifully. Yeah.
No, it's an exquisite scene. It's
Yeah. They were they're lovely people. They were just wonderful. You know, I love the time when I do get to Aboriginal communities. I do love it. I mean, so privileged that we live in this country, and you know, the oldest living culture on earth. You know, it was a real privilege to make that film.
Thank you so much.
Some of you might be.
Oh, sorry, Chris.
Some of you might be interested. I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who has had a lot to do with Aboriginal communities, and he's writing and researching the involvement of Aboriginal communities along the northern shores of Australia during World War II. I don't know whether it's going to be a book, but it's probably going to be a fairly well-researched. His name is Stuart Philpott. You might have come across him. He has done a lot of advising and helping with setting up Aboriginal commercial businesses, and but he's got into this, and he started to tell me about it, and we're going to get him to come and talk to our men's shed. But the interesting thing is that, you know, 36 airstrips were built between Cairns and Darwin, mostly by Aboriginal workforces. And
we deal in Bill's film about returned servicemen, and we also deal with the slavery in Western Australia. Yeah, I mean, there were also these services were terrified. You know, there's a lot of Secret Service documents that they were spying on Aboriginal people in the north because they were terrified they were going to side with the enemy when they invaded. And that's true. I mean, there was one whole community that were rounded up and sent south because people wanted to get their land, which was good, by writing false rumours that they were marching and preparing for the Japanese to come over from New Guinea and take over, join up with them.
good grief.
There's a lot of stories like that.
Yeah. Are there any further questions from the audience, or shall we? I think maybe in that case we'll say our thanks to you.
How many Deloras have you worked on? Stella?
Very quick one. When's it going to be shown on TV? Right now.
Which one?
The Lousy Little Sixpence.
Well, I do know Daryl might be able to tell a bit more about, is it the Thornbury Cinema?
Ah, yes, I should mention that. I don't think Gus is here. He was earlier, I think, but Gus, who runs the Thornbury Picture House, has suggested having a screening next week, which is NAIDOC week. And since Dan Andrews announced the lifting of restrictions today, the cinema will be back. So I think that screening will definitely go ahead. And although Alec won't be able to be in Melbourne, I'll be there to just introduce the film for a few minutes beforehand. So yes, so if you want to see it in a cinema, which would be fantastic actually, because being a 16mm film, it will look lovely.
Well, I mean, the NFSA, thank you very much to NFSA for digitising.
Yeah.
Another little story, if I might say, I thought I'd lost the negative.
Oh, no.
And for years, Andrew Pike at Ronan kept saying, look, the 1-inch tapes are getting pretty worn out. Can you give us a negative to do another copy? And I'd go, well, sorry, Andrew, but I was moving house, and it was a tumultuous kind of end of a relationship and moving house, and somehow they got lost. When I had all these cans, but when I looked for the cans, I thought I lost them, but someone from the National Film and Sound Archive was in Canberra, went to the Australian AIATSIS, Australian and Torres Strait Islander collections over in Canberra, and they were looking there, and they suddenly saw 2 lots. And one was My Survival as an Aboriginal and Lousy Little Sixpence, and they were both the A and B rolls. They would been there for ages, and I think it must have been the Neg Cutter, maybe when they closed business, I forget her name. They delivered, and that had been there for years. So it was the National Film and Sound Archive who discovered the A and B roll negatives, and out of that came generously did a digital copy. So the screening now look fantastic.
Yes.
They did a great job. I mean, great job.
Thank God you didn't lose the negative. That's wonderful.
I know. I so like, oh man, and people would say, the National Film and Sound Archive used to ring me up and say, do you have the negative? We want to make a copy. And I go, I'm sorry. How could you lose it?
Look, that's absolutely wonderful to know that it's going to be shown at the Thornbury Picture House.
Where is that?
Very, very, well, it's in High Street, Thornbury, and it's a wonderful little cinema run by Gus Berger, who's on our Melbourne branch of the.
Love to be in there.
And it's yes, it only holds 57 people. I think they'll only be able to have 20, won't they, Daryl? At this stage,
I think so, yeah, there'll definitely be restrictions. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Anyway, that's a wonderful piece of good news to end on, to know, Alex, that your historic and timeless film is going to be shown yet again in Melbourne. Yes, I think Melbourne deserves this after what we've been through. And it's one of the most important films, I think, that's ever been made in Australia.
Oh, thank you.
I will thank you, Alex, and I will, Chris, we can close this meeting then, I think, and say thank you to everybody, to Daryl very much for this and for all of you. So, okay, Daryl, will you?
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec.
So, Chris, will you close the meeting?
I will.
Good, thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Chris.
I look forward to Hunt Angels.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Good.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Alex.
Thanks,